gather we have people here of all different levels. Some of you already, mashallah, know so much and have the reward for acting by that knowledge, and others of you can look forward to the reward of learning. And so I'll keep this as a very gentle and generalizing talk about the Arabic language and what significance it might have to us as Muslims, particularly those of us who don't yet know it, and contemplating this great forbidding mountain that we seem to have to climb before we get any further. And perhaps, since I have to scoot off reasonably promptly, if I talk for half an hour or so, and then we have an opportunity for some questions and more general discussion. Arabic language is significant, and it's not significant in the way that many of us think it is, because although clearly it is the key, and the only key that fits the door of our texts, so we have no access to the tradition, basically, or no reliable access to the tradition unless we have the language. Nonetheless, it also reflects what you might describe as one of the more interesting tensions that are at the heart of the religion itself, and the way in which we understand ourselves as members of the Ummah of Islam. And the nature of that tension is as follows. The Quran tells us and proclaims to the world that Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has been sent rahmatan lil alameen, as a rahmah, as a mercy, as a source of love, compassion to al-alameen, which means really to everybody that has the capacity to understand and to respond, jinn and mankind and all the nations. This is one of the khasa'is of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. One of the things we need to know about him is that he has special properties, khasa'is, for which he is unique. And some of the ulama, like Imam al-Suyuti, have written whole books which just list the ways in which Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is unique. Unique amongst other people of his time, unique amongst people of all times, and also unique amongst the prophets. There's three different ways in which his uniqueness takes place. Now, Imam al-Suyuti in particular draws our attention to the fact that Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is unique in a way that is in itself unique, in as much as he is the only prophet who has been sent to all mankind. There's a sound hadith that tells us other prophets were sent only to their own peoples, but I am sent to all mankind. And bu'ithtu linnasi kafa, I am sent to all mankind. And this, you could say, is the greatest of his khasa'is. He has other khasa'is, but also great in terms of other ways of looking at the deen. The mi'raj, for instance, is one of his khasa'is. Many aspects of the sharia, also of his khasa'is. The way in which tahajjud was incumbent upon him in a way that it wasn't incumbent to the same degree for other members of the ummah. The way in which the sawm al-wisal, the continuous fast, 24 hours continuous fasting or even longer, was permissible for him but isn't permissible for other Muslims, and many other areas in which he is, in a sense, set apart from the run-of-the-mill of humanity. Perhaps the greatest is this fact, this extraordinary historical fact, that he is sent for all mankind. And if you study history, you can see what that means in terms of the unfolding of the way in which Allah has arranged the story of our species. Because he comes at a time when a world is disintegrating and really has come to an end, the ancient world of the Greeks and the Romans, and a new world is starting up when things start to move to the northern side of the Mediterranean from the European perspective, when different type of division of the world starts to materialize. And in many ways, of course, that isn't just one of the contexts for the emergence of Islam, but it was produced by the emergence of Islam. The emergence of Europe as a unit really dates from the time when the Muslims split the Mediterranean world so that Europe fell back on its own resources. We don't need to look into that in great detail now, but what we do need to realize is this universality of the Prophet's mission, and the way in which the religion therefore has to have an authentic way of being for all of its members. And if you look at the map of the traditional Ummah and compare it to the map of the traditional Christian Ummah or Hindu Ummah or Buddhist Ummah or whatever, you'll see that ours is in practice the faith tradition that is sprawled over the most gigantic tract of the planet. One of the other interesting aspects about it that's closely linked to this is the fact that it does not suppress the individual genius of the peoples that it transforms. It lifts them up. It takes people from where they are and lifts them up much higher. It identifies their specific genius and purifies it, rather than requiring complete annihilation of what they hitherto have been and a new start. It's not a born-again type of transformation that occurs when an individual or a community becomes Muslim. So we have this universal dimension, and if you travel in any traditional Muslim community, you will see that the Muslim world is articulated and is very diverse culturally. And this is something that a few Muslims nowadays feel uncomfortable with, because we think Islam should be a totalitarian, uniform phenomenon, everybody exactly the same, behaving the same, speaking the same. This has never been the way of the Ummah at any point in its history. The reality of Islam is that it's a great kaleidoscope of different national geniuses. The Bosnians have a particular Bosnian way of being traditional Muslims, the Turks, the Malaysians, the Indonesians, the Africans, whatever. And in due course, I think we'll see some kind of British or American or other forms of Islam emerging. This is inevitable. And it's part of one of the proofs for the reality of Islam, and one of the proofs for the validity of Islam as a religion is that it can do this, despite its origins at a very specific point in space and time, 7th century Arabia. Nonetheless, and despite the fact that it provides us with a detailed blueprint for how to live, it works beautifully, immaculately, uncomplicatedly, in such an enormous, indefinite variety of human experiences. So that's one of the Prophet's khasa'is, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Another is that he is an-Nabi al-Arabi, the Arabian Prophet. And this is so important as to be mentioned in the Quran itself. Firstly, as part of the Quran's insistence that every prophet is sent with the lisani qawmin liyubayyina lahum, with the language of his people to make things clear to them. The most obvious reason why he should have spoken Arabic and why this is important is that his immediate matrix was an Arabic one. If he'd been speaking in Bosnian or in Persian, he simply wouldn't have been understood. And one of the qualifications for valid prophecy is balagha and fasaha, that you have to be eloquent and coherent and beautiful in your speech, so that the message is conveyed in the clearest possible form. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in that basic and obvious way, was an-Nabi al-Arabi. He was the Arabian Prophet. This does not mean, however, that an Arabianness has to extirpate every other dimension of the historical Muslim experience. What it does mean is that the universal dimension of Islam is articulated in terms of the language. But there are particular dimensions of Islam that are articulated in the vernacular languages of those particular communities. And the traditional Muslim world has always balanced that in a particularly beautiful and very stable way. So that wherever you travelled in the traditional Muslim world, you went into a mosque, you would see essentially the same ibadah, variations, legitimate ones according to the four madhabs, but essentially the same rite towards the Kaaba, and the language invariably Arabic. And of course it's a shart, a condition for the validity of the salat, that the recitation be done in Arabic. The only possible loophole is if people are new converts and they simply can't get their vocal cords around those strange sounds, that they're allowed to say the recitation in their own language until such time as they can do it properly in Arabic. But otherwise it's absolutely obligatory that it be done in Arabic. So that's the universal aspect of the religion, articulated in terms of the Arabic language. And we could say wherever there is Arabic in the Ummah, there is universal Islam. The Islam of the one who is rahmatan lil alameen, a mercy to all the world. And that is the unifying force of the Ummah. You could say the fiqh for sure is a unifying force, the doctrine is a unifying force, many other registers of the Muslim sciences are unifying forces. But the most profound one, I would say, is the Arabic language itself, which is, after all, the matrix in which all of these other disciplines are expressed. Another aspect of that is, of course, that the universality of the Ummah has traditionally been cemented by means of Arabic as a language of trade, Arabic as a means of universal cultural communication. It was a lingua franca, so that any Muslim trader, Ibn Battuta, for instance, who in the 14th century wandered from Tangiers as far as Muslim communities in China, southern Russia, different parts of Africa, never had any difficulties with language, as far as we can tell, because the Muslim communities with which he traded, which he met, they themselves knew Arabic and he could communicate with them. So another important aspect of Arabic as the key to experiencing the universality of Islam is this practical reality of Arabic as the language of cultural communication amongst Muslims traditionally. And this is now being lost. And you could say one of the most insidious and least noted threats to the integrity of the Ummah. And this principle of universalism is something that's a doctrinal necessity. It's not something that we can negotiate. One of the most insidious threats is the diminishing of Arabic as the global language of the Muslims. Even 100 years ago... Sorry? Yeah, I'll try. Even 100 years ago, virtually all serious work on Islamic law, Islamic theology, and many of the other Islamic disciplines, Islamic history, almost invariably this was done in Arabic. There were some exceptions, particularly in the Persian world, which of course extended into India, where many works, particularly history, poetry and so forth, could be done in Persian. But generally that was an exception to a rule that was universally regarded as the ideal. One of the things that's happened since the colonialization process and the fragmentation of the Muslim Ummah into national states is that the Western ideology of nationalism, which recognizes language as a fundamental constituent of national identity and a legitimate grounds for drawing borders between peoples, irrespective of their religious affiliation, that this has broken down this former source of universality. So that now a lot of serious Muslim thinkers are writing in other Muslim languages. Traditionally this always happened, but there was always an Arabic dimension that was overarching. Now the most serious work on Islam in Turkey is done in Turkish. It never used to be the case. The great theologians of the Ottoman Empire, like Abu Sa'ud, who wrote one of the greatest of all tafsir, were done in the Arabic language. Kemal Pashazadeh, the Mufti of the Ottoman Empire in the time of Sultan Selim, wrote the great majority of his works in Arabic. That no longer happens. Very few non-Arabic Muslims now write their principal contributions to the intellectual life of the Ummah in the language of the Quran. Few exceptions, particularly in the Indian subcontinent. Sometimes some of the Iranian mullahs will write in Arabic, but this does seem to be dying rapidly even in those places. So we have a fragmented ummah because of our loss of this universal principle, this single key to everything else. And this is also happening among Muslims in the West. Perfectly legitimate that Muslims in the West should be speaking English or French or Spanish or whatever. No less legitimate than Muslims speaking Turkish or Persian or other languages that historically have been absorbed into the Islamic communion and slowly Arabized as key elements of vocabulary, pushed out and replaced with Arabic equivalents. Nothing wrong with having a vernacular language. What is dangerous is when the elite is no longer communicating with the rest of the ummah in the language of the revelation. Because it really is only in the language of the revelation that the purest and most authentic and least polluted interpretations of the revelation can be done. So this is, you might say, a taster of the significance of the Arabic language. It is a proof of the universality of the religion. It is a dynamic that has held the Muslim Ummah together despite its extraordinary geographical extent, despite the fact that it has never been united after the first century. Despite its extraordinary extent in history, 1400 years of it, the glue that held the operation together was the Arabic language. So, this, inshallah, will alert us to the huge significance of Arabic as a doctrinal given of the religion. Now, there is another more imponderable reason why Arabic is important. And this is that it is the sacred language of Islam. Okay, it has a political significance, it has a practical significance in terms of acquiring the Islamic disciplines, but it also has a sacred resonance to it. This is more difficult to talk about. It's to do with the life of the spirit. Arabic is the language that is used in the universal revelation of the Quran. It is Qur'anan Arabiyan. Allah Himself uses the word Arabic as one of the attributes of His book. Other prophets, earlier prophets, spoke in their own languages. But the Quran, the book of Islam, is articulated in the Arabic speech. So also is the Hadith Qudsi, which is Allah's words expressed through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but not forming part of the Quran. And the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was chosen as an Arab, indeed as the most pure spoken of all of the Arabs, in order to articulate for himself via the ordinary Hadith his interpretation, his vision of the new religion and how it was to be. So you have this enormous literature. In fact, it's the largest of all pre-modern literatures. The Hadith number perhaps over 1 million separate narratives. The ulama have different ways of categorizing what is a distinct Hadith. Sometimes two very similar Hadiths can be regarded as one Hadith, sometimes they're regarded as different ones. So we can never say exactly how many Hadith there might be. But 1 million is not an unrealistic figure. Some will say 500,000, some will say 600,000. And this literature is all, without exception, in Arabic. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does nothing without a hikmah, without good reason. And when we look at the map of the world in the 7th century and at the communities to whom the universal revelation might have been given, the Chinese, Japanese, the Koreans, the Zulus, the Aztecs, whoever, we can see that in order to create Islam as this universal religion and as the middle religion for the middle people, the ummatan wasatan, and historically Islam is right at the center of the world's principal landmass. Arabia clearly is a sign of Islam's universality, the fact that the religion originates in time in Arabia, and specifically in Makkah. And Arabia is the language of the Arabic people. So the Arabic language is in a sense chosen, this process of istifa, choosing, which is also an affirmation of purity, which was the means by which the Prophet ﷺ was elected to prophethood, also applies to the Arabic language. And this allows us to say that the Arabic language is objectively superior to all other languages. There are many ways in which we need to reflect on this. The most important way is that it ties directly in with what Allah says right at the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, when He taught Adam all of the names. عَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. He taught Adam all of the names. If you look at the books of tafsir, you'll see that there is a rich variety of interpretations of this. But the one we need to be aware of in this connection is that when Allah names something through His own speech, that name is objectively correct. It is the true name for a thing. When He says kitab for a book, that's the true word for a book. When we in English say book, or the French say livre, or whoever else who has a name for a book, that's just a term that has evolved historically. It's through a process of wada, of invention and convention and convenience. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses a word for a phenomenon in His creation, that's the true name for it. It doesn't mean you can't use other words in other languages, but it means that it's the real name, that there is a link, a metaphysical link between the name and the one thing that is being named and the one who is doing the naming. And this is a key to understanding why we get the reward from Allah when we recite His book. When we read the Quran, even if we don't have tadabbur, we don't understand its meanings, we just read it, perhaps we're not familiar with Arabic and we read it, that in itself brings us a reward. Why is that? It is because by reading the Quran we are entering into this, as it were, cosmic dynamic of Allah's naming of the things of creation. We are, as it were, resonating with Allah's own speech. Sometimes I have a lot of Christian students in Cambridge, and I draw a parallel which leaves them somewhat at a loss, which is that the great Christian experience of relating to God, they think, is through communion, which is eating the flesh and drinking the blood of the Word made flesh. It's rather cannibalistic and unpleasant image, but they're so used to it that they don't see it's a little bit distasteful, particularly since eventually the Word made flesh, or however they understand it, has to be passed out through the waste matter of the body. Whereas in Islam, we have something that's a good deal more inspired and more beautiful, which is that we breathe the Word. When I say Alif Lam Mim, something is connecting me to the one who said Alif Lam Mim before the beginning of time, and we are resonating with His word and being transformed by it. To the nafas, the breath, which is connected to the nafs. The word for breath and the word for spirit is often the same in a number of languages. So we're doing something very profound when we use the words that Allah Himself has used for phenomena. And nowhere is that in a more crystallized and pure form than when we recite His word, His quintessential word, which is the Quran, which is the pure speech of Allah, which has no contamination from humanity or any other source in it, but is pure divine speech from beginning to end. So to read the Quran from Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim to An-Nas is a tremendous thing and has an effect on us, whether we know it or not, whether its effects are immediately evident or not. And much of Islam is based on this realization, and that realization is based on the importance of the Arabic language. Dhikr really is to be done in Arabic. Qasidas and ilahis and nasheeds and so forth, fine, do them in English or Bosnian or Hopi Indian or whatever language will get the message through. But dhikr itself is to be done in the language of the Quran. If I say Allah, 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 or Astaghfirullah, 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 with due intention, facing the Qibla in a state of wudu, that inshallah will have an effect on me. If I say God, 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 or I'm sorry God, or however one would do it in a very profane language such as English, it doesn't have the same effect. If I'm really concentrating, maybe it'll have some psychological effect on a superficial level, but use the language of revelation, the language that existed before we existed, before the world existed, then immediately you are, as it were, tugging yourself into an energy that predates the rest of the cosmos and will have an extraordinary effect on you and will trigger all of those switches that have been in you since birth but generally have been unused, and start to find yourself being brave. So this is another important aspect of the Arabic language. Another aspect, and perhaps the aspect that we tend to neglect because it seems so exotic and strange, that even without understanding a concept, just mentioning the word for it plugs us into something of the ghaib, of the unseen. Now, what I want to do now, before suggesting that you offer some comments or some questions, is to look at in what sense Arabic is needful for us living in the West, and most of us presumably not native speakers in the language. And the great majority of native speakers of the language, I would say, also need to learn Arabic. They have no justification for being smug. Arabic, particularly in the last few decades, has veered tragically away from the pristine norms that we find in the Quran and the Hadith. Of course, there is a need for new vocabulary as new technologies and understandings of the world develop. The language has to augment, but it has lost much. And it has also been oversimplified and degraded in the language of the newspapers now, the language of popular fiction, the language of films, which defines the Arabic of most native Arabic speakers is not the real Arabic. They need to know Arabic, learn Arabic as much as we do. So those of us who are facing again this great mountain and have this himmah, inshallah, to scale it, need to be aware that if we really wish to get the most out of religion, and religion really is something that is a divine gift to us, it's not something that we deserve. It's Allah saying, here it is, this is the way back home, take it or leave it. If we're going to treat the religion in that way as Allah's gift to us, and see how Arabic is going to make that easier for us, we need to be aware of the fact that the Islamic heritage is no more accessible to us in English, really, than is an authentic, transformative spirituality brought about only through using a profane, man-made language. What I mean by that is that a translation of the Quran is not a translation of the Quran, even if it says a translation of the meanings of the Quran, which is a rather strange kind of expression, but the one that we've come to use. But you really don't get the Quran by reading it in English. You really don't. And if you look at any tafsir book, and the tafsir literature has not been translated into English, you'll see that there are different levels of each Quranic verse. That the ulama have been so much in love with the text that they have spent perhaps 50, 60, 70 pages of commentary and recording the views of the ulama just on a single ayah of the Quran. And you'll see the great range of interpretations that are there. Sometimes there are interpretations about when the verse was sent down. which can also lead to discussions as to whether the verse is abrogated or abrogates another one. And that too is part of understanding the Quran. Sometimes there are discussions about the linguistic detail and beauty of the Quran, sometimes to do with its balagha, its rhetorical effect. Sometimes they're to do with the hukum, the actual ruling, because perhaps 10% or so of the verses of the Quran are actually to do with the do's and don'ts of religion. Sometimes it's to do with the spiritual life. The Quran says it's hudan lil muttaqeen. What exactly is huda? What is guidance? Who exactly are the muttaqeen? Long commentaries, sayings from the Sahaba, Hadith, sayings from the ulama, and so forth. So each verse of the Quran to the traditionally learned Muslim is a trigger for a whole range of new associations in his mind. He reads, or she reads, one verse, and immediately all of these other things are triggered. If you just read the translation and you don't have that item, then you just progress through the text, and it really isn't the book of Allah. Allah didn't speak in English, he spoke in Arabic, and that means that it's the language that's at the core of this whole web of connections, of commentaries, of rich insight, that once you start to read, you realize how it is that the ulama have had such a passion for the Quran. How it's ma'dabatullah, it's Allah's banquet, and the ulama sit around it, and it's what they love. Another aspect of this is that the Hadith literature is certainly not accessible to us if we don't have Arabic. That's for sure. Because there are virtually no tolerable translations, even of the meanings of the Hadith. Mohsin Khan's rendition of Bukhari is ugly, it's inaccurate, it's partisan. Again, it needs a commentary to explain a lot of things, because Bukhari himself has different riwayat. We think that Bukhari is one book. In fact, that's not the case. Many hadith in Bukhari come in different versions, sometimes very small variants, sometimes quite significant variants. There's the riwayah of Al-Kashmayhani, for instance, which is frequently cited in the commentaries. Once you translate Bukhari, you have to pick and choose between those. So automatically, a translation is an interpretation. It isn't really a translation. So we really are facing a closed door if we really want access to the beauty and sophistication and the wisdom of the Hadith literature, unless we know the Arabic language. It really won't open itself up to us. And we need the Arabic language to a reasonably high degree, because the language of the Hadith is a very exalted, very beautiful, very refined Arabic. It's probably, after the Book of Allah, the most beautiful Arabic you'll find anywhere, and it's endlessly cited when the writers of Arabic dictionaries or of proper Arabic prose style want to prove that a usage is correct, is fasih, is eloquent. More often than not, they'll give you a hadith showing that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used that word or that expression or that verb in that particular context. And Bukhari and Muslim and these Abu Dawud and these other things that we think have been translated are in fact just the tip of the iceberg. We talk about Sihah al-Sitta, the 6 sound hadith collections. And perhaps we add the Muwatta of Imam Malik, and perhaps we add the Musnad of Ibn Hanbal. Perhaps if we know a little bit more, we add the Sunan of Daraqutni, and the Musnad of al-Humaydi, the Mustadrak of al-Hakim, and perhaps a few more recondite texts. But what we don't know is that the real hadith literature, which was the basis for traditional Islam, includes at least 600 hadith collections that any traditional alim can just quote to you. And very often, even more astonishingly, there are hadiths, the so-called hadith musalsal, which is a hadith that's memorized by an individual muhaddith on the authority of his shuyukh through an isnad going back directly to the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam. That may well appear in Bukhari, Al-Hakim and the others, but that muhaddith has it by his own isnad. And I saw this once with a muhaddith in Makkah, Sheikh Muhammad Yassin al-Sadani, Allah yarhamu, who could do this. He would close his eyes and he would just recite. He would say, Haddathani al-Walid rahimahullah, my father, may Allah have mercy on him, related to me on the authority of so-and-so, on the authority of so-and-so. Mentioned 20 or 30 people going back to the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam. It's called al-Isnad al-Musalsal, and there are still a handful of people here and there in the Ummah, mainly in the subcontinent, who can do that. So what access do we have to that if we don't have Arabic? Well, we just observe in a kind of stunned way, but we really can't benefit from it. So Arabic has the effect of inculcating a certain humility. So Arabic has the effect of inculcating a certain humility. The more you learn about Islam, the more you realize that you don't know much about it. This has always been my experience. And once you have access to Arabic, and you've put that key in the door, and that door is opened, and you see library after library after library just waiting for you, then you realize the real greatness of this religion's scholarly apparatus. And then you get angry with those people who tell you, yeah, Islam is very simple. Islam is Quran and Sunnah best. Well, that's actually not the case. Islam is a good deal more complicated and more brilliant and more profound than that. True, on a certain level, Quran and Sunnah best, because that defines the revelation, and Islam is about following the revelation. But how you get to the Quran and the Sunnah, your madhab, your route back to seeing it, lies through Arabic, has to lie through Arabic, or it lies through some form of following somebody who has access to Arabic. But doing it yourself, never. Doing it yourself, never. I once encountered a group of new American Muslims who were sitting around in a mosque, and they were looking at Mohsin Khan's translation of Bukhari to try and figure out whether it was legitimate for them to go and rob a liquor store. They thought, Islam is Quran and Sunnah, and here's the Quran in translation, here's the Sunnah in translation, we can work it all out, we don't need the books of fiqh. They didn't know Arabic. Even if they'd been able to read Bukhari in Arabic, they would have seen that there is a good deal more here than meets the eye. There's 6,000 or so Hadith. There is a lot that needs explication. Whether they'd ever heard of the fact that there are 600 significant Hadith collections that are regularly quarried by the ulama in deriving the doctrines and the rules of fiqh, I doubt very much. But it should be a reminder to us that without Arabic, without real Arabic, any claim to work things out for oneself is complete nonsense. Of course, there are other adawat al-ijtihad, to be a mujtahid, to practice the religion direct for yourself from the Quran and the Sunnah. You have to know the nasikh and the mansukh, the abrogating and the abrogated of the Quran. You have to know the sayings of the Sahaba. You have to know where there has been ijma' and where there has not been ijma', and what the controversies were surrounding the nature of that ijma', whether it was regional, whether it was a particular generation, and so forth. You have to have full access to the commentary literature, and the commentaries on the Hadith are enormous. And many of the longest ones have never even been printed even in Arabic. It is a gigantic literature. So you need all of these things before you can even begin to claim Quran and Sunnah in that simplistic way that they have in their minds. But if you don't have Arabic, of course none of that becomes possible. You can't check what's abrogated and what isn't abrogated because you can't read the commentaries. You can't look at the commentaries on the Hadith. You can't see what the fatwa of the Sahabas might have been, except insofar as some of them might have been translated, but no doubt there are others that haven't, so you get a skewed view of what the Sahabas' view might have been. Really, all of the Islamic disciplines depend on an adequate knowledge of the Arabic language. And if we have any aspirations to study Islam seriously, then Arabic has to be our first port of call. And it's a difficult language, but it's not as difficult as is sometimes made out, because it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is too generous to limit access to the core, the living core of the religion and of the revelation, just to those who happen to be aberrantly gifted in the acquisition of languages. Arabic is not as hard as people think. Arabic is a question of divine idhn. If you have the right intention, Allah opens it up for you. Rather like memorizing the Quran. I know people who have approached the Quran with the right intention, not knowing Arabic, and within a year they've memorized the entire text, even as adults. I've seen cases of this. Why? Because it's Allah to teach. He is the Alim, and He is the one who teaches. There is no act of memorization that happens without His decree. So it is also with Arabic. So we must certainly not be demoralized by this mountain that apparently lies ahead of us, because Allah is the one who can open up the language to us, and it comes almost without our noticing it. But the intention has to be right. The intention has to be that we need this language so that we can taste something of the beauty and the delight and the savour of the revelation. Because there's nothing more beautiful than the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is how the hard-hearted, this is the only point of access to the hard-hearted Arabs of pagan Makkah. The only part of their lives that was at all beautiful was in the language. Everything else, their architecture, their standards of life, their family life, their system of worship was disgusting. But the language and the poetry, that was beautiful. And Allah found a place in their hearts through the language, through the Quran. And that's the source and the fount of all Islamic beauty. It comes from the Quran. Wherever you travel in the Muslim world, if you look at a mosque, you'll see that the Quran is there somewhere. Wherever you listen to traditional chanting or dhikr or recitation, you'll see that the culminating moment is where the book of Allah is recited. Calligraphy, the supreme Muslim visual art. Beauty in Islam means the Jamal of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is mediated to us through His speech, through His kalam, and that is accessible to everybody. That is accessible to everybody with the right intention. And it's a great thing to be able to read the text for oneself, to be able to check things for oneself, to be able to memorize and understand at the same time, which helps the process of memorization no end. Because if you don't know the meaning of the Quran, then if you're, for instance, a hafiz and you're reciting in Tarawih and you're stuck, if you know the meaning, it helps you to remember what the next bit is likely to be. If you don't know the meaning, then you're stuck. It's just another sound that you're supposed to produce after you've come to that particular barrier in your memory, and you can't get past it. If you understand the meaning and you're enjoying the meaning as well as the sound and the experience of communing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you get past it. So there are so many advantages, and so much of our religion is made much easier for us when we have made this intention to learn the Arabic language, to listen to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaking in His own language, which is the language of the people of Jannah, to listen to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam speaking in his own language, and he was afsahu man nataqa bid-dad. He was the most eloquent of all people who spoke the Arabic language. Then you start to experience Islam in its true sense, which is a thing of beauty. Everything in this religion that Allah has sculpted for us is a reflection of the divine beauty. There is nothing in it that is not beautiful and satisfying and uplifting to the human spirit. One of the most reliable ways of appreciating that is through learning the Arabic language. So inshallah we'll all have the intention to learn as much as we can, and also make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open this door for us, because nothing happens except with His will and His permission and His decree. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. If anybody would like to ask a few questions, hopefully related to what I've been saying, I'd be more than happy to try and
Well, unfortunately, I think one has to point an accusing finger at the Arab countries. Many countries in the world actively promote their languages. So wherever you travel in the Muslim world, you'll find the British Council, which teaches English. You'll find the Goethe Institute, which teaches German. You'll find the Institut Français, which teaches French, and the Italians have something. They're all keen to push their national interest, their culture, through pushing their language. The Arabic world and the Arab League has never done that. They don't set up centres in London and New York for the teaching of Arabic, except in a very dilatory and inefficient and unimpressive way. So it would be good if we could somehow nag them to do that. But in the interim, it depends on people's individual situations. And the technique of learning also depends on the individual. Some people who have learnt languages, other languages, the European way, if they've done Latin or French, find that a textbook on language that is written for Europeans will actually take them through rather faster than will a traditional Islamic text. Because most of the traditional Islamic texts, those that are most frequently used here, are generally written for people who already are native speakers. And it can be very difficult if you don't have a teacher to work through something like the Ajurumiyya from scratch. It's really not designed to be that kind of text. So although some people will insist that you have to do it the traditional Islamic way, and learn the Mulhat al-I'rab of al-Hariri or the Ajurumiyya or whatever, I think that we can be a bit more relaxed about it and say, whatever way works for you, inshallah, is a sign of divine permission. This is the way He wants you to go. The ulama say, at-taysir alamatul idhn, that facilitation is a sign of divine permission. And if you find that you really learn the language quickly and get the vocabulary behind you by picking up some textbook written by a non-Muslim, which is what I did, then you assume that this is by Allah, and you say Alhamdulillah on that basis. Some people don't find that helpful. Some people like the very traditional Muslim way. That also is an extremely efficient way, and also has more barakah, because all the traditional Islamic texts were written by people who were in a state of dua and dhikr, and were always praying that this text be acceptable to Allah. And one can be spiritually uplifted by reading one of those traditional texts. But operationally they can be much more difficult unless you have a very good teacher. So I would say that whatever method works for you is the right method.
If the sisters have any questions, can you just say them out?
That would be tremendous. Yeah, but who would read it? There's an operational difficulty in as much as English has a lot of vowel sounds, maybe as many as 30, and in America probably as many as 100 in some parts of the country. Complicated diphthongs. And actually writing with the Arabic script, which is really a consonantal script that's designed for a language with only 3 vowels, it would require considerable modifications. That can be done. Any number of new strokes and squiggles can be added to the Arabic script. As yet I've not seen a successful attempt to do that, but it has been done. And in fact, Dutch, which is of all European languages the one that's closest to English, has been written in the Arabic script. There was an episode in the 1870s when the Muslims of South Africa sent to the Ottoman Khalifa for a teacher, and he sent somebody called Abu Bakr Effendi, who was from Kurdistan, who went to Cape Town, and he wrote a complete text on fiqh, from wudu through to inheritance law, in Afrikaans, which was the language of most Muslims in South Africa at the time, but using the Arabic script. And it was actually printed in Turkey. And a copy of it found its way back to the Dutch Orientalists in Leiden, and they couldn't work out which language this was. And it took 20 years before they realized it was actually their own language, because Afrikaans is basically a dialect of Dutch. And I've looked at that text, and it does seem to work. He obviously invented off the top of his head some special squiggles for vowel sounds that don't exist in Dutch. That could be done, but what worries me is that it would immediately make text published in those scripts very esoteric and accessible only to a very small number of people. I would love to see it done, and with new computer typesetting technology it's quite easy to do, much more easily than it would have been, say, 100 years ago, when you had to invent a lot of new characters for an old hot lead printing press. Now you could do it in an afternoon with a font workshop program on a computer with Arabic support. But my own view is that it shouldn't be done, because it just adds another hurdle to people's understanding of the religion. And if somebody goes into an Islamic bookshop and they see texts, they don't know anything about Islam or the Arabic script, and they see some texts that are in an unfamiliar script, it's yet another barrier between them and the deen. So apart from certain very select circles where perhaps it could be used for writing letters, for instance, I think it's probably not something we should be exploring. But you're right, something I should have mentioned, that traditionally virtually all Islamic vernacular languages were written in the Arabic script. Even languages like Catalan and Spanish and Galician and Belarusian and Polish were all written in Arabic script amongst the Muslim communities. And in some cases, in those places, you'll still find people today who can use that script, and it's been dying away. But whether we should do it in Western Europe, I suspect probably not at this stage. I suspect probably not.
Sister, a question?
I think she's bringing a piece of paper. you give us some examples of good intentions to make when approaching learning Arabic? I don't think that a specific phrase needs to be used. I think you just need to make the intention in whatever language that you're doing this to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to make it easier for you to experience the beauty and the wisdom of the language of the revelation, and that every moment you spend in memorizing words and in learning how the verbs work is going to be a form of ibadah for you. Just make that brief intention as you start out. That inshallah is perfect, is sufficient. Yeah.
Would you say that not knowing Arabic necessarily is what spiritual practice?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think Arabic will take you faster forward in most cases, as long as it's not accompanied by some kind of pride and sense of superiority to others who haven't done it. But there are many cases of great saints in the Islamic world who have not known Arabic. In Turkey, for instance, in Bosnia, in the subcontinent, particularly in more popular forms of piety. But a real spirituality that is grounded properly in the Islamic ulum will be greatly facilitated by knowledge of the Arabic language, because Islam really doesn't approve of exalted forms of spirituality that are not accompanied by a full awareness of and practice of the outward forms of the religion. The two have to go side by side. Imam al-Qushayri says, إِنَّمَا حُرِّمُوا الْوُصُولِ لِتَضِيعِهِمْ الْأُصُولِ. They were only prevented from attaining because they wasted the foundations. Which means that as we progress spiritually, every brick in every step that we step on has to be intact, and we can't just put up a few in the hope that they'll take us up to the next stage and they may collapse behind us. That's certainly not how it happens. Islamic spirituality is based on sobriety, and it's based on sharia, and it's based on fiqh, and it's based on learning. It is possible to become a saint without that, but that's not the way we should be aspiring to. We should be going through the door that's right ahead of us, which is the door of the Zahir.
Any questions? What are the between text that we than traditional like when people like
Basically, it's a text of the kind that they will use in Egypt. At the Azhar, for instance, they use versions of the Alfiya of Ibn Malik, which is a long poem in 1,000 verses, slightly over 1,000 verses, which they get everybody to memorize. And sometimes also they use text by somebody called Ibn Mu'ti, but usually it's the Alfiya of Ibn Malik. And the traditional style is that you memorize those 1,000 verses and really you've got Arabic grammar pat, because there's no ishkal, no problem of the language that might trouble you, that cannot be resolved if you have those verses at your fingertips. Yeah, there are smaller texts, and some of them have been influenced by Western styles of teaching language, and there have been significant problems in maintaining high standards of Arabic in the schools in the Arab world. Partly because it no longer is regarded with admiration by the elites. The political elites who design the educational system regard Arabic as something that's indigenous, and what they really like is English and French, and often will speak in those languages amongst themselves. So amongst the elite ruling classes in the Arab world, frequently a knowledge of Arabic is extremely poor. If you watch any of the Arab politicians giving a speech, they murder the language. And one of the things I did when I was working in Saudi Arabia was to edit people's business letters and their speeches. And I found that basically anybody over the age of about 45 could write a beautiful business letter in nice Arabic. Anybody under the age of about 40 generally couldn't. Schools would fail them, and they sent them to me to put into proper Arabic, which was a freakish kind of situation. Speeches, when they had to give speeches for opening construction projects or whatever, they really couldn't do it in Arabic. Even if I wrote it out for them with the full tashkil, with the vocalization, they would still make a mess of it. The standards are calamitously poor. Although in some ways, mass media has improved things because everybody watches films and there's a certain standardization. And some of the more outrageous regional dialects are starting to die when people have an ability to recognize classical forms. But the textbooks that are produced for the national curricula in most Arab countries now are not really based on traditional models. They're attempting to overcome this psychological block that a lot of young Arabs have regarding Arabic as incredibly difficult by abandoning traditional methods and bringing in Western methods, which are just not appropriate because they're based on Indo-European languages which have a completely different logic to them and have to start with different structures. Occasionally you will find some texts, some longer texts they use in the secondary schools that do have a pedigree stretching back to things like the Alfiya of Ibn Malik, and also the Mulhat al-I'rab, which I mentioned earlier, which is by Hariri, which is a shorter matan on Arabic. I think it's about 350 lines, and sometimes they will even quote lines from those texts. In the schools at Al-Azhar and the Qarawiyyin and the traditional Islamic faculties and universities, they still use the traditional texts, as far as I'm aware. Or at least for beginners, they will use simplified versions of those texts. So the Ajurumiyya is an absolutely classical text that would be uncontroversial in any traditional Muslim learning situation. There was a couple more questions and then I should head back to Cambridge.
Any questions? You mentioned in your talk you mentioned that Islam is not simple religion. In your article, Sunnah has described Islam in a way Islam simplicity. I suspect you did it.
I mean, existentially, the practice of Islam is simplicity itself. You can't imagine a simpler, more primordial form of worship than prostrating yourself towards a blank wall. No other religion has a simpler form of worship. The system of fasting is very simple. What I meant with it when I said that the religion is not simple is that the processes by which we discover the religion from the sources is not simple. It's highly complicated and sophisticated. And the ulama cracked it in the Middle Ages. They worked it out, and we have, alhamdulillah, a very unified system of reading the revelation which comes through the four madhabs. And anybody who seeks to step outside the four madhab system to work things out for himself or herself realizes how extraordinarily complicated are the nusus, knowing which hadith is abrogated in another hadith, what are the exact circumstances of a particular hadith. For mut'a marriage, for instance, the controversy in Algeria at the moment, some of the Salafi radicals there say mut'a marriage was not abrogated, it's still valid, and they're doing it. And you get into that argument and you discover that there are approximately 800 dalils that are traditionally used in that argument. Not just Quran and Hadith particularly, but a lot of fatwas of the Sahaba and claims for abrogation. And you really have to be able to not just know those 800 dalils, but to juggle them and to know which has priority before you can decide whether mut'a marriage is halal or haram. And that's not unrepresentative. So when I say Islam is not simple, I mean the task of the ulama is not simple. In reaching back to retrieve the original simplicity, they have to take a path that's enormously sophisticated. But the Islam as experienced by ordinary practicing Muslims is something that's very beautiful in its simplicity. I think that's everybody's experience. Particularly those of us who come from a Christian background where everything is really complicated, the theology is really complicated, the system of worship is really intricate. If you look at what goes on even in a basic Anglican evensong, you'll see what I mean. Our ibadah is very streamlined by comparison with theirs.
Last question. Another question? Anyone have a question?
Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair. اللهم تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. اللهم إنا عبادك وبنو عبادك وبنو إمائك ماض فينا حكمك عدل فينا قضاؤك نسألك بكل اسم هو لك سميت به نفسك أنزلته في كتابك أو علمته أحدا من خلقك أو استأثرت به في علم الغيب عندك أن تجعل القرآن العظيم ربيع قلوبنا وجلاء صدورنا وذهاب همنا وغمنا، وأن تجعل الحياة زيادة لنا من كل خير، وأن تجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين بسر الفاتحة.